We are most grateful to Nancy Stewart for being NAPE's Schiller Lecturer for 2022.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I am deeply honoured to have been invited to deliver the Christian Schiller Lecture this year from the perspective of early years, and also really grateful for the spur that it gave me to engage with his writings. Schiller's insights into the nature of learning for very young children sparked many moments of recognizing a fellow devotee of observing children and marveling at their wonderful capacities. With a flash of seeing history repeating itself, I read his account of how his young grandchild was using language in original ways to express his own thinking. His account was when he had been playing on the floor with his grandson, building some bricks, and the grandson was able to see the top of his head from an unusual perspective. He wasn't used to seeing up there. And he said, "How come your hair thin on top?" Now, my husband John won't thank me for sharing this, but flash forward 50 years, our 2-year-old granddaughter on his shoulders, when she got tired on a long hike, suddenly shouted out, "John has a hole in his head." So the same thing. But more significantly, in reading Schiller, I was frequently struck by echoes of my own thinking about the purposes of education and how that must translate into our responsibilities for working with the youngest children. I've also reflected on Schiller's optimistic view of progress in education. He talks about it as a slowly gathering, slithering worm that builds energy, and it may seem that nothing is happening, but then there's a pulse and things move forward. Very optimistic. But as I survey the current landscape, policy and practice, I consider whether it always goes forward, or do we need perhaps a less positive view that change could take us backwards, not always forward. Most importantly, I applaud Schiller's central conception of the child as a growing being, growing in feeling, as well as understanding and skills and knowledge, and impelled by the child's own nature. The educator's role then becomes one who cherishes, who nourishes, and helps a child to grow.
This image of the powerful child aligns with the principles of the English early years foundation stage, which can be interpreted as placing the unique child as the prime mover of their own development. In the processes of learning and development, the child brings their unique characteristics, which include innate desires to become more competent, to have agency, and to relate to others. Through experiences, then, in enabling environments and in the context of positive relationships, both of which are provided by supportive adults, development and learning flourish. Growth, of course, proceeds from the beginning, from the bottom up and inside outward. So a seed, which holds the blueprint of the tree, first becomes a sprout, which becomes a sapling, which then reaches outward and upward. And just as we would not help the growth of a young apple tree sapling by attaching to its branches a few heavy fruits from an older apple tree before those slender limbs can support them, so we do not support the growth of young children by imposing upon them expectations and requirements that are appropriate for children at a later stage of their development. And just as it doesn't help a young tree if we shower it with high-potency fertilizer, which would encourage fast but weak growth before it's got its own roots and its own resilience. Neither does it support young children to give them a diet of undigested material, which might enable them to score well on narrow test items in the short term, but it doesn't give any lasting support for them to continue to do well as older children and adults. There remains within educational debates a stubborn lack of consensus about the purpose of education. And this applies in relation to early childhood just as strongly as beyond. What is early years education for? There's a long-standing tension between being and becoming. Are we to focus on the child and the quality of the child's experience right now? Or are we to focus our sights on getting ready for the next stage? School readiness is a highly contentious term, and it is a key purpose of the EYFS according to the statutory framework. Schiller would disagree. The education of young children should be seen not as a preparation for something to follow, but as a fulfillment of a stage of development. Educators contribute, he says, so that children might live more abundantly. Fulfillment and living abundantly, these are wonderful words. They conjure up what can be seen in the best of our nurseries and reception classes. In these settings, there is a climate of caring and exploring, sharing, learning. It's a joy to children and adults alike. If our purpose is to support fulfillment of the stage, that stage of growth of early childhood, we must have a clear conception of the central course and unique nature of development from birth to age 5. This period it's called the foundation stage with good reason, because children are building the primary structures that will support so much later growth. In a simplistic view, sadly current among some commentators and expounded by Ofsted, the EYFS, as is all education, is about knowledge. We should focus on building children's foundation knowledge within subject areas, developing from the very beginning a curriculum which can show systematic steps into the national curriculum subjects. With many schools now enrolling 2-year-olds, this systematic mapping backwards of subject knowledge is to be applied downward even to toddlers. Yet there is plentiful evidence of which critical foundations are being built in these early years, and they bear little relation to national curriculum subjects. Crucially, from birth, children are building brain structures through rapid neural connections as neurons fire in response to experience. Born with a lot of neurons that aren't wired together. But through the first 3 years, a dense network of connections is built, and the brain of a 3-year-old is twice as busy as that of an adult. But after this initial burst of neural connection in the early years of life, the process of pruning begins, losing the connections that are not much used in order to create a more efficient brain. So, frequent, consistent experiences in early childhood are necessary to build the positive brain connections that will continue to support strong functioning in a number of foundational areas. Of course, as we grow older, we do continue to learn and the brain continues to adapt to experience, but not with the ease and rapidity of that sensitive period of development that is the early years. It takes much more repetition to build a connection later. Anyone embarking on learning another language as an adult can testify it's not the easy process it was as a baby moves into their understanding using their mother tongue, or children pick up second or third languages. Similarly, we know that those early attachment relationships that are part of the wiring for emotional connection in the brain matter early on. And it's very hard to change attachment patterns later in life. From the period from birth to age 6, which you see across the bottom here on the slide, the window of sensitivity for brain development in particular areas is wide open. Begins to close rapidly as children move through those first 6 years and beyond. So on the vertical axis, you can see how open is the brain to this wiring, how wide. So let's watch what happens to those windows. So as well as brain structures for sensory perception, including vision and hearing, the brain wires up ways of responding. Am I open? Am I curious? Or do I back off? Ability to control emotions, learning language, and relating to others. All of these develop rapidly in the early years, but are more difficult to influence later on. These are developmental areas in which the brain is primed to rapidly encode a child's experiences, and these must receive primary attention in the early years in order to, in Schiller's words, enable all children to develop to the full at each stage of growth. This principle has been well understood by early childhood thinkers. As Maria Montessori wrote, the child has his own laws of growth, and if we want to help him grow, we must follow him instead of imposing ourselves on him. Tina Bruce expressed this succinctly in her first bedrock principle. The best way to prepare children for their adult life is to give them what they need as children. The EYFS, rather than endorsing the downward projection of national curriculum subject areas, does identify what children need as the 3 prime areas of development learning: personal, social, and emotional development, physical development, and communication and language. These are truly the foundations as babies and young children grow as feeling, thinking beings through physically experiencing the world with their senses and through movement. They learn to trust in themselves and others through loving and consistent attachment to caregivers. And they learn to think in more precise and abstract ways through the wonder of words which define and communicate. These are areas that we must build strongly in the early years as foundations for all that comes after. There is a further crucial sphere of early development which doesn't fit into subject areas at all. It's a cluster of traits which used to be known as perhaps attitudes and dispositions for learning, and they cut across all areas of learning and development. In the EYFS, these are identified as characteristics of effective learning. They describe what children do as agents of their own learning. And many early years educators would give prominence to these characteristics in recognition that learning is an active process that belongs to the learner, not the teacher. Teachers' input in offering experiences, giving information, quote, covering the curriculum, it's of no consequence if the learner isn't involved, making the links, developing the concepts in ways which make sense in their own minds. Developing powers to learn in early childhood establishes a base from which children can continue to flourish. So foundational habits in the early years include building the emotional and mental habit of engagement, engaging through playing and exploring, and the experiences which will provide the raw material for children to learn from. Exploring with curiosity, using play to connect ideas and experiences, having a go, taking a risk, new challenges. Moving on, to get the most out of their experiences, children have to be active in their learning. They have to be motivated to focus with high energy and avoid distractions and persist with challenges and bounce back after difficulties and enjoy meeting challenges for their own sake and reaching their own goals. And then, for learning to take place, the learner must engage in thinking, having their own ideas, thinking of possibilities, making mental links in their experiences to build theories and concepts, critically making plans, monitoring, adapting, reviewing. Now, the impetus for all of these learning behaviors comes from within the child, and it's strong at birth. Alison Gopnik has researched the astounding mental capacities of young babies and children, and she says human children are the best learning machines in the universe. They're not only processing a constant intake of new data about the world and drawing conclusions, testing their understanding and so on, but they're doing so with extraordinary drive and persistence. Babies push themselves to try new things which we may take for granted, but are major challenges to someone who's new to the world and to their own body. So consider this baby around 4 months old who's practiced waving her hands and seeing what she can make them do and is perhaps playing with them in front of her vision, and then suddenly sees something else waving about in the farther distance, starts to connect that to internal sensation to realize, oh, I might be able to control these feet, and then grab them and perhaps with great success bring them to her mouth to explore them a little more. Well, that's taken focus and effort, and at every stage, a baby or young child is driven to move on to the next possibility, having a go, bouncing back, persisting with difficulties, thinking, learning as they become more competent, and are rewarded by the internal satisfaction that brings. Researchers at Penn Green have described toddlers experiencing a feeling of what they call chuffness, that thrill, I can do it. Well, although these positive learning attitudes and behaviors arise naturally within a child, they can be dampened by experience. Being treated as a passive receiver instead of an instigator, quickly rescued from any difficult challenges, can result in a self-image that says, I can't. Learned helplessness. Being trained by others to do their bidding through rewards and sanctions drains the well of intrinsic motivation and internal reward, which is the source of deep learning. And a lack of interest and support for a child's thinking with limited opportunities to develop their own ideas and approaches dulls keenness of mind. The result is an others-regulated child, the opposite of what's being increasingly recognized as the foundational importance of self-regulation. There has been evidence for many years that particular approaches to early childhood education result in lifelong benefits. In the Perry Preschool Project, 3 to 4-year-olds were involved in a high-scope program which emphasized children's agency. A plan-do-review structure was used for children to organize their play. Adults were involved in supporting their play. And when adults planned activities, they always left room for children's individual ways of interacting with the materials and challenges. Initial studies didn't find significant academic attainment for these children as they went through the primary years compared to children in control groups who went to very direct teaching preschools or free play preschools. But remarkably, when followed into adulthood, there were striking differences. Something in that preschool experience led to the high scope children by age 40 having higher educational qualifications, higher earnings, more stable relationships, more community involvement, and much less crime and mental illness. Similar striking findings came from the ABC project, where children from disadvantaged backgrounds were randomized either to receive an early childhood education, which focused on cognitive and language development, or simply routine health and social services. Planned activities in the ABC approach consisted of a series of playful back and forth exchanges between the adult and child. Other elements included enhanced caregiving and sharing books in a child-led conversational way. There are some words there to note, which we will come back to a bit later. Playful, back and forth exchanges, child-led, conversational, as well as the integral role of caregiving. Follow-up studies over the years found that program children had consistently higher reading and maths attainment and higher IQs as they went through school. By age 30, they were 4 times as likely to have graduated from college, more likely to be consistently employed and not receiving public welfare, less likely to be involved in crime, and were in better mental health and health. Recent neuroscience research sheds new light on why some early years programs may have had lifelong benefits. MRI structural brain scans of the ABC participants at age 40 showed large changes in their brain structure, particularly for males. Compared to controls, those in the early education group had increased size of the whole brain, including cortex, and in specific areas relevant to language and cognitive control. Early childhood experiences literally build brains. Surely this is a fundamental purpose of the early stage of life, that early growth, and our responsibility as educators must be to support this. Working with early years educators over many years, I've many times pointed out to them what an important role they play in children's lives, with a range of research showing that different experiences in early childhood provision show up years later in children's outcomes. So I asked them, knowing that what you do is important for children's futures, what comes to your mind as the first most important things that you want children to take with them when they leave you? The answers are consistently similar. You see there, I've put it on the flip chart when we all think for a minute and then feed back. But these sorts of things, confidence, curiosity, relating well to others, communicating, self-belief, thinking for themselves, being healthy and active, seeking challenge, resilience. If these sorts of development areas are the core of what matters in early childhood, then it should be reflected in our curriculum for the youngest children. Today's young children, who will grow up to take on jobs that we can't yet imagine and face future problems beyond our expectation, they deserve an education for the 21st century which supports development of these lifelong skills. Newspaper headlines often quote official statistics of how many children have reached what the government defines as a good level of development by the end of the EYFS. So, are they fulfilling this stage? Though, unfortunately, most attention is on how many children fail to reach the mark. The measure includes those prime areas, which I agree are core, but then they also add on literacy and mathematics. That's where children fall down, and we get the statistics that tell us that children aren't ready for school. Well, I think the inclusion of those subject areas both reflects and leads to a heavy emphasis on those areas. And I believe that's a misguided interpretation of good early development. Research shows that focusing on the 3 R's in the early years can give you higher scores in the short term, but the effect wears off as children grow older. In fact, in the UK, children begin formal teaching in literacy and numeracy 2 or 3 years before children in most other countries. But the later starters elsewhere equal or exceed the attainment of children in the UK by the time they finish primary school. Benefits that last a lifetime come from programs that emphasize what the early years is really all about. Emotional security, stability in warm relationships, exploring the world through movement, physical sensation, building communication and language, developing emotional and cognitive self-regulation, independent thinking, problem solving, and really becoming motivated, confident learners who want to and believe they can know and do. This is at odds with what the government and Ofsted are telling us, which is that we need a carefully sequenced curriculum in subject areas. Ofsted insists the curriculum should be based on knowledge. What specific pieces of information do the adults decide children should commit to their long-term memory? The emphasis is on deciding what we want children to know and then judging how well they remember what we decided they should learn. How children learn, or how we go about supporting them, the pedagogy we employ, is not of interest to inspectors. I've seen a current curriculum inspection report which criticizes the educators for paying too much attention to how nursery children are learning rather than the knowledge content. But what if what we want for children is practice in how they learn, that consistent building of those structures for ongoing learning? This is not to say that areas of knowledge in the early years are irrelevant. Young children gain knowledge all the time across all areas, and interests in particular subjects or cultural tools, such as literacy and mathematics, provide contexts for children to learn more and build links in their mind, build more complex understanding, and to practice being a learner. We do have a responsibility to open doors for children, to share information and strategies, and widen experiences. The important question, though, is less what exactly we introduce to children, but more how we will go about it. The quality of children's experiences matters. Many of the most important elements of early development cannot be directly taught. They must be lived, and lived through repeated, consistent experiences to become part of the growing child. Consider this not yet 3-year-old writer. She writes on a playhouse with chalk, making marks, to which she ascribes words. She clearly understands the nature of writing and how it encodes speech, and reading, therefore, and how it gets the speech back out of those marks. She uses the language of some previous literacy experiences. She clearly has received letters that have been read to her, and so she knows to say, "Dear so-and-so," and then include her text. She asks the adult to do some writing at one point, saying, "You are a writer." She knows she is a writer. Let's watch her.
I hope you like the picture. I dare you to come. And Nancy, I want you to come soon. Dear Nancy, I will write it on my letter. Okay.
Okay.
And then I'll come straight away. Dear Nancy, come soon. Okay. That's stupid. That's stupid. Do you want to write some writing on my tree house?
I'd rather you write it. Can you do some more?
You are a writer. You only write.
I do. Shall I do some writing now?
Yes.
So, this is a rich experience of literacy embedded in her play. She's completely in charge of what she's doing. The adult responds to let her lead the activity. And when we consider the whole child in that experience, we can see some of what she knows and understands about writing. We can see some of her interests. But equally important, how she feels about this experience, her pleasure and satisfaction, how she is learning through having a go, trying it out, making links, and also what she is learning about her own powers to creatively make choices and follow her own ideas. Schiller does not use the term agency when he describes his vision of children's growing capacities. I think research on the importance of agency and self-regulation has gained prominence after his most active period. Schiller framed his insights into children's powers in his own way. "I am talking about choice," he writes, about making a choice, about the effect on an individual of making a choice. It is the supreme expression of being an individual, a person, to make a choice, a decision. You know that in yourself. It makes one feel differently. He goes on, "The capacity to choose is a human power, and like all human powers, it grows with exercise. If we are to release children's powers in every human activity, to release them and help them to grow, then every child must grow in his capacity to choose." And here is perhaps the most difficult problem of teaching, he says, since we can succeed only so far as we rely on influence instead of power. So we come to a central issue in early childhood education. How does an adult support a child's burgeoning powers? What pedagogy will nourish the growth of the child? There has long been both confused and confusing discussion of the role of play in early education. Early childhood education is often described as play-based. In play, children do build their powers as learners. They make choices based on their intrinsic motivation. They find and decide their own challenges. They decide what to do, who to do it with, how to do it, how long to do it. Find out how to manage conflicts. Learn to think flexibly and imaginatively. Play is the ideal venue for experiencing agency and practicing self-regulating learning behaviors. But questions arise about how play relates to other educational experiences, especially when attention turns to attainment across the curriculum. The dominant debate has long been about the merits of free play, which is totally under the control of the child, versus direct instruction, where adults plan and control the activity. There's also been somewhat problematic calls for structured play or well-planned, purposeful play. But it could be argued that when adults structure and lead the activity, it's not in fact play at all. Teacher-guided activities might have elements of hands-on engagement. They might be enjoyable, but they're not play if the adult has determined the objective and made all the plans and decisions, leaving the child with no room to think for themselves, no agency. Many adult-led activities might look somewhat playful on the surface if they have child-friendly themes or materials, yet more appropriately be seen as formal didactic teaching with a gloss of age-appropriate delivery. This rigid dichotomy between free play and direct adult-controlled activity, direct teaching, is breaking down, with current attention focusing on a continuum rather than two discrete approaches. Along this continuum between free play at one side, without any involvement, and adult-determined activity at the other, lies a more subtle, negotiated space, which has been described as guided play. Here, the adult does have a significant role. First, in preparing and refreshing that environment, which is inviting, flexible, open-ended, well-resourced, the enabling environment of EYFS principles. Beyond that, the adult has a critical role in the midst of children's play, observing to see whether there is something an adult partner could usefully add, sensitively joining where appropriate to support the child's purposes, interacting to extend the challenge, and thinking in back and forth exchanges, which can offer adult expertise while respecting the child as the leading partner. Moving further along, but not hijacking the play completely, the adult might introduce their own purpose into the child's play, offering but not taking over. The child can still take it or leave it. Further on, the adult might initiate a specific activity aimed at an adult-determined objective, but ensure there is room for the child to make choices within that and respond flexibly depending on the child's input and ideas. This is highly skilled work, requires the abilities to tune in to each child's mind, to keep possible extensions in mind based on sound knowledge of child development as well as subject knowledge, and an ability to communicate as an equal with young children, to rely on influence rather than power, in Schiller's words. Back and forth exchanges have been identified as the primary support we can give young children's development and learning. From the very beginning of copying a baby's facial expressions and babbling and peekaboo, all the way on through turn-taking conversations with a 4-year-old. The number of conversational turns has been shown to bolster language development rather than simply how much language a child hears. Research into child-led but adult-supported play has found benefits for language and cognitive development as well as emotional regulation. A recent study found that guided play was more effective than direct teaching in developing children's math skills and cognitive control, and equally effective in other areas. The common elements of guided play include the adult having an objective in mind, which might be planned, that the adult has chosen, or it might arise in the moment. And the child remains in the lead. The adult doesn't take over. The child is free to engage in their own way. The ongoing back and forth is an improvised dance between the partners, and it may move in unexpected ways. Building foundations in this way, providing rich ground for that young child to grow, get the roots down into strong soil and pulling up a lot of inner strength. It might not show quick gains early on as through direct teaching, where there's a high focus input, but nourishing the healthy growth in aspects that matters enables a young plant to continue to flourish. However accurate we may be in responding to and scaffolding a child's growing understanding, the interaction must be grounded in relationship. I've been talking quite a lot about cognitive growth and cognitive self-regulation. Emotional self-regulation is integrally tied into learning and developing, and fundamental. Children are growing as feeling beings. And as Schiller reminds us, young children explore the world, but the world they explore is people. People matter most. So relationships of warmth and contingency. I listen to you, I am with you. Cherishing the growth of the young in this way is quite different from approaches that may be adopted in response to pressure early years educators face today. A carefully defined and sequenced curriculum leaves little scope for a child to surprise us with their own unpredictable mental connections. I recently had an unexpected talk with a 4-year-old on a hillside hike. He was using a walking pole, which was shrunk down to its shortest size to work for him. And he was surprised at how it had such a sure grip on the slippery rocks. And we were talking about how useful it is to help us to not fall over, almost like we had an extra leg. And he then asked, "Do these sticks have a magnet in the point?" This was an example of pure scientific thinking. He observed a phenomenon which raised a question in his mind. How is it sticking? And he thought of analogies to other things he knew, and he came up with a theory that might explain it. It's like a magnet. I acknowledged that it did seem to stick like a magnet, but I didn't think it did have a magnet. And we then, as we walked along, wondered whether it was something about the shape of the hard metal tip that made it grip so well. Contrast this with an example I heard recently from a school providing a case study of exemplar practice in employing a carefully constructed curriculum in a reception class. The school had identified speaking in complete sentences as an objective. The teacher reported that she had asked a child a question and he answered, "Cow." The teacher modeled, "It is a cow." No response from the child. So she said, "You say it after me. It is a cow." So the child complied, "It is a cow." She then said to the whole class, "Everyone say this after me. It is a cow. It is a cow." Well, if I were that child, with my own thinking and expression treated in that way, that lack of respect for my own ideas, I think I would be very reluctant to venture anything more to that teacher. And then I wouldn't have practice in putting my own thoughts into language. This reductionist view of children's learning was also illustrated in the school's identified objective that by the end of reception, children would know the name Guy Fawkes. The teacher had discussed with the school's history coordinator the progression, which revealed that Year 1 children were to know the story of Guy Fawkes. So it's enough in reception to just know the name. That's tracking backwards and narrow and meaningless to the child. Seems to me an impoverished approach to early learning. Similarly, the dominant government-mandated approach to learning to read as sounding out phonetically regular words, including nonsense words, is a tragic shadow of the rich thrill that reading should be, the thrill of sharing meaning. The focus on decontextualized synthetic phonics, enforced by the National Phonics Test, is being pushed downward to children in reception classes and nurseries. We risk pushing downward to our youngest children a deadening of spirit, as described in this exchange between two children and a researcher looking at transition into Year 1. She asked, "Is there anything you don't like about being in Year 1? First boy said, "Being on the carpet for a long time." Second boy, "Neither do I, because it's very boring." First boy, "And it wastes our time playing." Second boy, "It wastes your life." Listen to the wisdom of a boy who knows the purpose of this stage of his growth. Let us not waste children's lives. Instead of bending to the downward pressure from a knowledge-heavy curriculum, let's champion early years principles of starting from the child, giving children what they need now, and let us encourage this perspective to flow upward to the primary years and beyond. The damage of pushing top-down curriculum and pedagogy onto young children is clear. A cautionary tale. The state of Tennessee took on board that kindergarten might be a wonderful thing. Well, a year before they start school, looking at results of the ABCDarian project, for instance. So the federal government made available a lot of money to quickly get children into an extra year before they start school, to close the opportunity gap. Well, it provided an excellent controlled trial because they quickly set up a lot of places and children applied for them, but only half got in. There was a waiting list and some didn't get a nursery year. So you could compare. Well, to the disquiet of the researchers, they found that although the children who had the nursery year had better scores at school entry, they had worse attainment after 2 years. They had worse attainment after 6 years. They had more exclusions. They had more SEN, worse attendance. Why? Not just any early years experience. What happened to those children was that they had been put in this quick development of services into primary schools, which weren't established for early years. Primary teachers were moved down to lead the classes, and they used primary school approaches. When researchers looked at what happened in those classes, they found that these very young children were spending 25% of their time absolutely wasting their life in transitions, waiting to go to the toilets, which were way down at the other end of the school, standing in a queue waiting to be taken outside. 20 to 25% whole class teaching, in which they commented that maybe 5 out of 20 children were paying any attention at any point. Another 7% small group teaching, adult-led directive objectives. There's only 12% center time, choice time for them to go to different areas to play, and only 3% large muscle activity outdoors or in a gym. This was wasting those children's opportunity to build what they needed in this stage of growth. Since the time of Schiller's writing, government hold over educational practice has multiplied exponentially. Many of the government impositions seem to me to go backwards toward a more rigid and limited approach to education. Writing 46 years ago, Schiller was pleased that children were treated differently from at the beginning of his career. He said, "We have come to think of them differently. We no longer think of them as objects into which you push something called knowledge, and if it doesn't go easily, give it a knock." But I wonder now, when young children who are seen as falling behind expected standards are often prescribed additional structured interventions, which further remove opportunities to nourish their growth through time to play with skillful adult support. Something to consider carefully when we have a lot of talk about catch-up and loss of learning. I do have hope, however, in a swelling of professional refusal to accept constraints on curriculum and pedagogy imposed by the government's current pronouncements. Last year, the government issued a new version of the EYFS, along with their approved curriculum guidance. Many in the profession of early years educators felt they had much more to say about how best to support young children for the 21st century. And it wasn't reflected in the government view. So this led to a groundswell of energy as 16 national organizations came together to develop and publish Birth to Five Matters, guidance by the sector, for the sector, which has been enthusiastically welcomed by nurseries and schools. And I have hopes that the consistent pushback against the narrow phonics agenda is beginning to gain ground. I believe it's time for rebalancing of the influence of government and professional voices. I support a call to stop education policy being determined by short-term views of ministers, replaced by a more consensual cross-body party and professional group to consider a longer view and wider perspectives. Perhaps we will get there. In the meantime, early years educators must believe in their own constantly evolving professional judgment and skill, and trust in children to be their partners in the growth and flowering of each individual child. Thank you.